So good afternoon. I'm Andy Rich. I'm Dean of the Colin Powell School, which is the School of Social Sciences here at City College. And I want to welcome you to a conversation about rethinking national security. This is an event whose origins trace to a conversation that one of our speakers today, Martin Hellman, had with our school's namesake, General Colin Powell. Dr. Hellman is Professor Emeritus of Electrical Engineering at Stanford University. He's a pioneer in the field of cryptology, having invented with colleagues public key encryption. And he's been a leading voice in debates about computer privacy. Since the 1980s, Dr. Hellman has also been a prominent voice in national security discussions. In 1987, more than 30 scholars came together to produce Russian and English editions of the book Breakthrough: Emerging New Thinking, Soviet and Western Scholars Issue a Challenge to Build a World Beyond War. Dr. Hellman was the co-editor of that important volume with Anatoly Gromyko. And since then, for more than 30 years, Dr. Hellman has been working on how to defuse the nuclear threat among nations and to broaden the discussion of how we understand national security. It was in the context of these issues that Marty had a conversation with General Powell some months ago. General Powell told him about our school here at City College. In turn, Marty told General Powell about his dad and his uncle, both proud graduates of City College. That's how we got in touch, and that's how the idea for this event was born. I actually put Dr. Hellman in touch with our other speaker today, Professor Rajan Menon. Professor Menon holds the Ann and Bernard Spitzer Chair in Political Science here at the Colin Powell School at CCNY. He's also a senior research scholar at the Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies at Columbia University and a global ethics fellow at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. Professor Menon is a prolific writer on domestic and international affairs, including about how the two should be understood as more directly connected in our understandings of national security. He's written a number of books about Russian and before that Soviet power, and his work dates in many ways from the same moment that Dr. Hellman pivoted to national security, the mid-1980s. Most recently, Professor Menon has been writing extensively on the pandemic and its domestic political implications, policy implications, and its national security effects. So we're very grateful to have both Dr. Hellman and Professor Menon with us today. Professor Diana Greenwald will moderate today's discussion. Professor Greenwald is an assistant professor of political science here at the Colin Powell School. Her work focuses on the politics of the Middle East, nationalism, conflict, and state building. Her current book project examines pathways and obstacles to self-rule for nationalist movements with a particular focus on the Palestinian case. Dr. Greenwald's writing has appeared in the National Interest, the Washington Post, and Foreign Policy. From 2017 to 2018, she was a postdoctoral research fellow at the Middle East Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School, and she joined us at City College after that. So today's discussion is framed around the following paradox. When World War II ended in 1945, our nation was secure from attack. Since then, we have invested trillions of dollars as a society in efforts to improve our national security. Yet, perhaps absurdly, we now can be destroyed in under an hour. In this age of pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, environmental crises, and nuclear weapons, we address today this question of, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? And if so, how do our current approaches to public policy need to change? We've invited Dr. Hellman to start off with some opening thoughts. Professor Menon will then respond, followed by Professor Greenwald stepping in to moderate. I want to invite all of you to share questions and comments throughout today's event in the chat from now until the end. Professor Greenwald will be moderating that space and pulling questions for our speakers. And we're also joined by Debbie Chang, our Director of Fellowships and Public Service Partnerships at the Colin Powell School, and she'll be helping to monitor questions as well. So please use the chat. Lastly, we're recording the conversation for those who cannot be with us right now, and we have muted everyone. With that, Dr. Hellman, let me turn it over to you. Thank you again for being with us. And given your family history at City College, I want to welcome you back to City College.
Well, thank you, Andy. I'm really glad to be speaking at City College, virtually speaking, and especially to the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. I owe City an immense debt of gratitude, as you pointed out. even though my grandparents came to this country as penniless immigrants over 100 years ago, both my parents and most of my aunts and uncles got great educations, almost free of charge, courtesy of the city college system. Now, they graduated roughly 90 years ago, but we still need that kind of opportunity today. And I was really glad, after speaking with Colin Powell, to find he recommended his book, and I recommended to you My American Journey. He wrote, if the Statue of Liberty opened the gateway to this country, public education, and he was thinking of City College clearly, opened the door to attainment here. So for the Yankee fans in the audience, I grew up in the Bronx near 190th Street and University Avenue. I would have gone to City College, money was tight, but NYU gave me a 4-year full tuition scholarship that made it cheaper for me to go to NYU than to City. Why was that? My parents lived within walking distance of what was then NYU's Bronx campus, the University Heights campus, now part of Bronx Community College. So I could walk there, whereas I would have had to pay 30 cents round trip car fare to get to City College. The topic today is rethinking national security. And it's based on my conviction and that of others, including here at the school, that our national security needs to be fundamentally rethought. Our current thinking is based on an outmoded view of the world. We still are acting as if nuclear weapons didn't exist, as if we could win a war with Russia or China. In reality, such a war has much too great a risk of destroying civilization. President Reagan put it really well when he said, a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. But we seem to have forgotten that, and how any war with Russia or China is too likely to escalate. Similarly, we're still acting as if we can vanquish, we as a nation, not we individually, as if we can vanquish the COVID pandemic by ourselves. So the evidence is clear, especially in New York City. We cannot do that. And here too, I mean, I've been isolated. We're still acting as if global environmental crises can be dealt with later, whatever that means. And the key idea behind rethinking national security is summarized in that short statement that Dean Rich read. And just to remind you, at the end of World War II, the United States was totally secure. Today, trillions of dollars later, we can be destroyed in under an hour. What went wrong? And so that statement, which has been signed by former Secretary of Defense Leon Panetta, among others, and you can find the statement on the website, and the link will be made available to that website, as well as others I'll mention. The statement that Secretary Panetta and others signed then asks, in this age of nuclear weapons, again repeating what Andy said, pandemics, cyber attacks, terrorism, and environmental crises, is national security becoming inseparable from global security? And if so, how do our policies need to change? Now, my talk's going to be brief, consisting of a few introductory remarks, with the rest of the event being a panel discussion, including questions from the audience. That format works well because I've written a paper that goes into detail, and the link will be made available along with other resources. So in these introductory remarks, let me tell you what rethinking national security is and what it is not. Rethinking national security is a series of questions. It's not a series of answers. There are a number of reasons for that. First of all, no one knows all the answers. I'd like to think that I do. I mean, I identify with my mind, but life has taught me otherwise. My wife also has taught me otherwise. Secondly, I've come to the conclusions that I have only after a lot of introspection and questioning. Even if some of my answers are right, they didn't sound that way to me at first, and they won't sound that way to most others at first. So we each need to do the work of questioning and opening ourselves to new perspectives. What else is rethinking national security and what is it not? Well, rethinking national security is essential to human survival. It's not optional. Now that's a big one, so let me unpack why that's true. Last year, I was honored to address the annual meeting of Nobel laureates, and that was the main point I made, that it's not optional, it's essential to human survival. Again, a link to the video of that talk will be made available. It's only a half hour long, but much longer than the 10 minutes I'll take today. In that talk, I noted that technology has become too powerful for us to continue on our current path. We need to start thinking longer term. Here I have time for just one example, but that's enough. My research has led me to conclude that the risk of a nuclear war is on the order of 1% per year. Now, you're not all mathematicians. In fact, most of you are not probably. So here's another way to think of it. If I'm right in that estimate, and you're a student who's about 20 years old, we're playing Russian roulette with your life, not once, but 4 times over your lifetime. That estimate would be equivalent to putting one bullet in a 6-chambered revolver, spinning the cylinder, putting the gun to your head, and pulling the trigger. Not once, but 4 times over your remaining life. Well, if the risk is that great, why isn't someone doing something about it? Well, fortunately, some very influential people are. Starting 13 years ago in 2007, so actually almost 14 years ago now, 4 respected senior statesmen called for the elimination of all nuclear weapons. George Shultz had been Ronald Reagan's Secretary of State. Bill Perry had been President Clinton's Secretary of Defense. Henry Kissinger, among other things, had been Richard Nixon's Secretary of State. And Sam Nunn had been chairman of the very powerful Senate Armed Services Committee. These 4 men explain why they took that position in a video that you can watch. Again, a link is available. And your school's namesake, 4-star General Colin Powell, who served as President Bush's Secretary of State and had earlier been chairman of the Joint Chiefs, introduces that video by saying, and this is a quote, so I'm going to read it. I want to introduce this film from the standpoint of a soldier who was taught to use nuclear weapons and as a diplomat who worked hard for their elimination. General Powell goes through his experiences starting as a young 2nd lieutenant assigned to guard a nuclear cannon in Germany. And he concludes, again a quote, "The one thing I convinced myself of after all these years of exposure to nuclear weapons is that they were useless. They could not be used. You can have deterrence with even lower number of weapons, but I mean, why stop there? Why not continue on? Why not get rid of them altogether?" End of Colin Powell quote. Now, Rethinking National Security phrases the goal differently. What I say is we need to reduce the risk of a nuclear war to the point that it's at an acceptable level. Now, that may well be the same as General Powell's getting rid of nuclear weapons altogether, but there are several advantages to the risk framework that I hope we can discuss later in this panel. Another very hopeful sign, and the sign that people are doing something, is that Congressman Jim Cooper of Tennessee, who's chairman of the Strategic Forces Subcommittee of the House Armed Services Committee, has taken a strong interest in this project. And he's written into law a study on nuclear risk that I'd only dreamed of for the last 10 years. And amazingly, coincidentally, that study starts formally in 2 days, this Thursday. That's quite a coincidence. What else is rethinking national security and what is it not? Well, it's not just about nuclear weapons. In fact, it's not just about weapons. It's about all the threats to our security, including pandemics and global warming. Here's how I phrased that in my talk to the Nobel laureates last year. So I'm going to read that. Science and engineering have given us physical power that traditionally was thought of as belonging only to the gods. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, only God could destroy cities with thunderbolts. Today, we call them nuclear weapons. Only God could cause a flood that would necessitate Noah building an ark, whereas human-induced global warming threatens similar devastation. Only God could create new life forms, but genetic engineering lets us do that routinely. In contrast to the godlike physical power that technology has given us, humanity's ethical progress is at best at the irresponsible adolescent phase. Nuclear weapons, environmental crises, and genetic engineering are not the real problems. They are symptoms of a deeper underlying problem. That is the chasm between our godlike physical power on the one hand and our at best irresponsible adolescent behavior on the other. Humanity, I sometimes say, is like a 16-year-old kid with a new driver's license who somehow gets his hands on a 500 horsepower Ferrari. We'll either accelerate our ethical evolution very rapidly or we will kill ourselves. In these brief remarks, I'll conclude with one last example of what rethinking national security is and what it is not. It's hopeful. It is not doom and gloom. One reason for hope may at first seem paradoxical. Over the last 40 years that I've worked on these issues, many people have told me I was on a fool's errand. But that's hopeful because many of the best ideas appear foolish before they pay off. The work on encryption that won me the $1 million ACM Turing Award, the highest honor in computer science, was seen as foolish by all of my colleagues until it paid off. At the annual meeting of Nobel laureates last year, I was able to ask 5 of them before I gave my talk whether the work that won them their Nobel Prizes was initially encouraged or whether it was derided as foolish. 4 of the 5 said foolish. So if you take the ideas that we discuss here today seriously and someone tells you that you're a hopeless dreamer or a fool, don't get mad. Thank them. Tell them that's the best compliment they could pay you. And remind them that you're studying at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership. Global leadership requires rethinking national security. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Rajan.
Thank you, Marty. Welcome to City College. I should almost say welcome back because your relative studied here. I cannot claim to have studied here, nor did my relatives go here, but I have had the privilege of teaching here since 2010 and belonging to the Colin Powell School under, most recently, Dean Andy Rich's leadership, and it's an incredibly vibrant place. My own department is the friendliest department I've ever taught in many years of teaching. And the students here are far more interesting than students I've taught elsewhere. So I feel very fortunate to be here, even though I can claim no personal connection with the school. Let me say that the problems that Marty has touched upon, some he elaborated and others he did not, the pandemic, nuclear weapons, and climate change, have 2 things in common. First, they are global problems and do not obey borders. Secondly, and relatedly, they make the concept of national security therefore obsolete because no one country through a national strategy can address them. It is a problem that is collective in nature. There's another way in which the term national security is, I think, in some sense obsolete. When I was in graduate school, and it continues to this day, national security was thought as involving the management of violent external threats. We call this the kind of bombs and rockets approach to national security. So if you go to any leading graduate program in the United States and sign up for a national security course, that is what you will learn about: terrorism, nuclear weapons, conventional warfare, and the like. But it seems to me we are at a time in this country, and indeed in the globe, where the definition of national security presented by the academy, that is universities, and by policymakers and by national leaders, no longer tracks with the issues that make people insecure on a day-to-day basis, be it flood or drought, lack of nutrition, lack of access to healthcare. If you ask Americans to list currently the top 5 things that make them insecure, I would suggest that the list would be, depending on who you ask, hunger, which is significantly increased during the pandemic, the ability to pay rent. There is an eviction crisis looming once a national moratoria run out, and joblessness, which is at a very high level. And if you look at by class and race, the lower down the income scale you go, the higher the unemployment. Unemployment for African Americans and American Hispanics is significantly higher than for American Blacks. The pandemic, and I just want to say a little bit more about the pandemic, then I'll close out, has a global dimension as well. In 2019, the World Bank's projection was that the reduction of poverty would improve by about 8.2%. For the coming year, and this year and the coming year, the projection is that it will get worse by that much. About 150 million people will be plunged into poverty. Of them, 70 million people will be plunged into what is known as deep poverty. That is, they subsist on about $1.90 a day. But it gets worse. There is a huge debt crisis looming, which makes the financial crisis of 2008, and indeed even the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s, look not so bad. This is much worse. The debt that's piled up now is about 2.1 trillion. Now, traditionally, developing countries used to borrow from governments as well as from international financial institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF. But in the last 10 years, because interest rates have been so low, the borrowing has been from private equity funds, pension funds, primarily through the issuance of bonds. So whereas governments are discussing now payment moratoria or debt rescheduling, we do not have any evidence yet that private actors are willing to do this, because ultimately they are responsible to their shareholders. There's a fiduciary responsibility. So we have, both in this country and globally speaking, a pandemic whose effects are really variable. So the argument we are all in this together does not really apply, because the crisis singles out those in countries and across the world who are the most vulnerable. So let me stop there. I don't have a rebuttal of any sort of rejoinder to what Marty said. Perhaps we can open it up now. Diana, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much, Rajan, and thank you, Marty, and thanks to the Colin Powell School for inviting me to moderate this event. I want to commend Marty as well for putting together this study and dedicating a significant chunk of his energy and time to this issue that he's clearly quite passionate about, towards, after a very accomplished career previously. So I am monitoring the questions in the chat as well. So we will get to some of your questions. Maybe I'll just open up with a broad question for both Marty and Rajan. This is kind of building on what Rajan was just describing, but the idea of transitioning from a concept of national security to global security seems to be really premised on this very hopeful and admirable notion that we can encourage cooperation between countries on solving issues. So instead of seeing things as kind of bargaining problems where we win and someone else loses, or they win and we lose, we need to promote more cooperation. And so I'm interested in both Marty and Rajan, your take on whether the issue of nuclear security and nuclear proliferation and disarmament presents more opportunities for that kind of cooperation, or is it in a way even more challenging than kind of promoting cooperation on some of the other issues that that Rajan's mentioned, such as the pandemic, climate change, and these kind of more diffuse actorless threats in the international system? So is one kind of more challenging than the other?
Marty, why don't you take that? I'll follow you.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, we need to transition from this concept of national to global security. And I'll tell you, the way I first came to this, what got me to shift from cybersecurity to international security, it was marital security. My wife and I have been married 53 years. We met 54 years ago. And for the first 14 years of our relationship, we did what most people did. We did what my parents did. We did what I saw in books. When we didn't get what we wanted, we threatened, we yelled, we were aggressive. And it never got us what we wanted, but we didn't use the scientific spirit. One of my key mentors in this area, who Sandra Day O'Connor also credits with being a key mentor for her, Professor Harry Rathbun at Stanford, now long since deceased. He was born in the 1890s. Harry defined the scientific spirit as a zealous search for the truth with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by observations. And Harry pointed out that we needed to apply the scientific spirit not just in science, but to interpersonal relations and international relations. If we did that, we'd see even at the rockets and guns, or whatever one would call this traditional approach to national security, even at that level, the old approach is not working. If we keep fighting wars, if we keep being aggressive, it's only a matter of time before that bullet comes up in the chamber, in that Russian roulette analogy, and civilization is destroyed. The mentality of war is sometimes thought of as the immovable object. And if so, I would say the survival drive is the irresistible force. And if the immovable object is met by the irresistible force, I have confidence that survival will win out. But first we have to get society to recognize that those are the two choices it has. Rajan, anything you would add?
Yeah, Diana, let me take the other part of this, and that is climate change. The difficulty, it seems to me, is that we all agree that we share one ecosphere, that climate change is a borderless problem. But in order to curb it, one ultimately relies on sovereign states. There is no government standing above sovereign states that can force them to live up to the commitments they have made. So if you look at the agreements on climate change that have been signed since the Rio Treaty of 1992, Kyoto 1997, and now the Paris Accord of 2005, of 2015, what you notice is that they have set very ambitious targets. There has been not much dispute about the magnitude of the problem, or that it is a serious problem. But in the case of the Paris Accord, precisely 10 countries out of about 197 are on target to meet what they have promised to do. And the possibility that global warming will be held to 2 degrees Fahrenheit during the course of the century, which is what Paris promised to do, is, I would say, virtually nil if one assumes that current trends on global warming expectations hold up and countries continue not to do their bit. The pandemic and the economic crisis that it creates will make the problem worse because countries will be much more unwilling to take steps that cost them economically during an economic downturn, such as, for example, a carbon tax. So that is the paradox. There's an understanding of this being a global problem. There's an understanding that it must be a collective effort. But ultimately, we fall back on sovereign nation states to address the problem. And there is really no way to enforce the agreements they undertake to commit. I talked to my a previous class about this just a little while ago, and we all left kind of scratching our heads saying, well, what do we do with a problem that's mounting that we know the seriousness of, but the track record suggests that we fundamentally haven't solved it because the political unit that we are organized in, namely the nation state, is ill-equipped to deal with a collective problem.
Just one thing I would add there, Rajan, you said we all agree, and I think you're talking about this audience. It's important to note that including at the highest levels of US government, there are some people who call this a hoax. And it's true that we don't know for certain what the results of human-induced global warming will be. But one of the questions I raised in my talk, talk to the Nobels was, how much certainty do we need before we act? And how bad do the consequences need to be potentially before we act? And so we need to look at the trade-off between uncertainty and inaction versus action and the cost. The one other thing I'd say, as a technologist, I'm hopeful that global warming can be solved through technology, not necessarily geoengineering. But a colleague of mine who started SunPower told me that when he started out in the late 70s on photovoltaics, it was $2,000 a watt. It needed to be $1 a watt or less to be economic. No one, he said, not even he, would have predicted a 2,000-fold reduction, and yet that's what happened. And if they had looked at the learning curves, they would have predicted it. So there's a lot of possibility there and I think we need to be funding research and development because, as you point out, otherwise we're not likely to make it, and we're not funding it as much as we should, especially at the federal level.
So just a friendly amendment, I agree with Marty that transition to non-hydrocarbon modes of production is the ultimate solution. The difficulty is that we've put enough greenhouse gases in the atmosphere already that the out-year effects will be at least 50 to 100 years in time span. And if you think about how long it will take for the entire world or the major producers of greenhouse gases to transition to clean energy, I doubt we'll see it in Marty's and my lifetime. And Diana, we may not even see it in your lifetime. And as for our students, we may not even see it in their lifetime. So I think in the short and medium run, while these new technologies come online, it's really imperative to come to some consensus on reducing overall emissions, because if they continue as they are, then we are headed for very, very serious trouble. We get into also this whole debate in curbing climate change about who should bear the cost. Should it be the West because historically it created the problem as a result of the Industrial Revolution? That's called the historical perspective. Or should it be a time slice perspective where we look now and say who are the major emitters, in which case in absolute volume, China and India rank right up there. China and India reply, well, no, it should be on a per capita basis. And this debate keeps looping around and around. And what happens is that you have agreements that large numbers of people sign on because it's almost cost-free. It sounds good to sign up to them. Some countries live up to them, others do not. The costs are zero. But in the long term, of course, as climate change increases, the costs are very high for all of us.
Yeah, so I see a lot of questions in the chat about specific countries. So we'll be, and regions, we'll come back to the Middle East, North Korea. I mean, just to follow up briefly on this point, though, of the role of the international community and international treaty law and international organizations. If we think about the nuclear weapons threat, I'm curious, Marty and Rajan, if you can reflect on, you know, to what extent international treaties and organizations such as the NPT have been successful, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, to what extent they failed. Is there a role for more international agreements or even international law around these issues, or are they destined to kind of always lack teeth in the way that Rajan's pointing out, and being able to kind of enforce compliance or enforce the goals that we might have around reducing nuclear weapons? So there's been a recent nuclear weapon ban treaty that's now going to enter into force, but was missing the signatures of all of the major existing nuclear armed states, and was criticized by countries such as the US and the United Kingdom for trying to enforce a ban on nuclear weapons instead of the more kind of gradual disarmament approach that is reflected in the NPT. So is there any kind of hope for these types of treaties or laws on this issue in the future?
So Diana, Marty, can I start with this and hand it over to you? Or do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
So Diana, on the treaty that you mentioned to essentially outlaw nuclear weapons, the good news is that it's been signed by 125 countries and 50 countries have ratified it. I think the most recent one is Honduras, based on a document that you sent me. That's very good, but those are countries that by and large have no plans to acquire nuclear weapons anyway, or don't have the capacity to do it. The 7, I think, including North Korea, 8 states that do have nuclear weapons to one degree or the other have not signed it, have no intention of signing it. And so that leaves us in a difficult situation, because one has to ask the question, well, what has been the progress? Now, you mentioned NPT. On the one hand, it is a global treaty that's kept the number of nuclear armed states limited. President Kennedy, I think at some point in his presidency said, I expect there to be 25 nuclear weapon states, and we don't have anywhere near that number. But my concern is this: if you look at the UN Security Council, which countries hold permanent seats with a veto? They are all nuclear armed countries. So we have, in a sense, bemoaned the fact that nuclear war is a problem and we ought to reduce nuclear weapons and make them more salient, but we endow them with an enormous amount of prestige. So it is not surprising that countries that want to get them find some way to do it. India did, Pakistan did, North Korea did, Iran for a while did. Now, the good news is, if you put your mind to it, successes are possible. I think Marty will speak more about this, but in the case of North Korea, in 1994, there was an agreement signed called the Agreed Framework. And the idea was to denuclearize the Korean Peninsula, and that North Korea would put out of commission all production facilities that could use enriched plutonium or uranium to build nuclear weapons. The deal was this: they would do that, sanctions would be lifted on them, there would be 2 new reactors, light water reactors, would be constructed for them, and they would be given a guaranteed supply of fuel for their economy. The 2 light water reactors were never built. The fuel was never provided. North Korea walked away from the agreement, which collapsed formally in 2002. In 2003, it withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. If you listen to the conventional narrative on this, it's North Korea, this irrational, crazy, rogue state. But the fact of the matter that it was engaged and there was a process in place which could have worked had the terms been abided by, not by North Korea, but by its other partners.
Yeah, Marty, do you want to jump in here?
Yes, good question. So a number of things. First of all, I'm a cockeyed optimist. I mean, that's the foolish part of myself. And I'm going to point to the fact that I have somewhat arbitrarily defined a threshold in a 2011 paper, a new thinking threshold, as 1,000 nuclear weapons worldwide. That's still a lot. We can still have nuclear deterrence. It doesn't require any fundamental changes in our approach, and yet it requires a fundamental change in our thinking. The good news is we are 40% of the way from the peak of the arms race to that new thinking threshold. That's amazing. People don't usually look at it that way. At the peak of the arms race, there were 70,000 nuclear weapons in the world, roughly. Today, there are about 14,000. We've reduced by 80%. We need to do another reduction from 14,000 to 1,000, which is a little more than a factor of 10, which is why we're about, I won't go into the math, but we're about 40% of the way to that threshold. Tremendous progress. Another thing is, as Rajan pointed out, North Korea is often said to have walked away from the agreed framework, which was working. By the way, the evidence that it was working was the agreement was in place from 1994 to 2002 when President Bush killed it, actually. He killed it for domestic political reasons. And those are not my words. They're the words of one of my colleagues who was a director of Los Alamos, the nuclear weapons lab, Sig Hecker. And it's not that the North Koreans are nice people. There was something in that. It was denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula, but there was something in it for them, which was better relations with the United States, which they desperately needed 3 years after the breakup of their main patron, the Soviet Union. And we unwittingly, the United States unwittingly encourages nuclear proliferation. It's not what we intend, but when we attacked Gaddafi in 2011 under Obama, a Democratic president, the North Koreans put out a press release saying, this teaches us that we were right to develop nuclear weapons, because in 2003, Bush had promised Gaddafi that when he gave up his nuclear weapons program, this good behavior, this good faith was the word, this good faith shall be returned. We did not return good faith. We got the guy murdered in a horrible way. And one other thing, I don't know if you mentioned it, Rajan, but those 2 large reactors that they were supposed to get were to make up for 2 other large reactors that were much more proliferation prone that they were building, that they stopped building. Yeah. And so in the end, they were unable to complete the reactors that they had been building because they rusted from exposure to the elements over 8 years, and they never got the replacement reactors. So you can make a case that North Korea feels cheated by us with better reason than we feel cheated by them, although both sides push the limits.
So if I could play a resident pessimist here for a little bit.
Go ahead.
I agree with everything that Marty has said, but I must say that looking at the present, I see a lot of reason to worry on the arms control front. So at the height of the Cold War, in terms of strategic nuclear weapons, so I'm not talking about tactical nuclear weapons or intermediate range, strategic nuclear weapons, those that can be fired from the United States to then the Soviet Union or now Russia and back. We had about 10,000 of them. In 1994, as a result of the START II treaty, we were down to about 6,000. And in 2003, as a result of the Strategic Offensive Reduction Treaty, SORT, we were down to about 2,200. Now, under New START, signed under the Obama administration, we're down to 1,550. So we've got down to 1,550 strategic nuclear warheads, but the treaty is supposed to lapse in February. It can automatically be renewed for 5 years, but we don't know yet whether it will be. And I suspect if President Trump is reelected, it may not be. I'm not even entirely confident that it will automatically be extended under a President Biden. So there's that. The second problem is the Iran nuclear deal. So the joint and comprehensive agreement to JCPOA, signed in 2015, essentially cut off the plutonium path and the uranium path for Iran to get nuclear weapons for a period of 10 to 15 years, depending on what part of the treaty you reach. President Trump, of course, is withdrawn from the treaty. The Europeans and the Russians and the Chinese so far say, we are going to assume that we are still part of the agreement. But the Iranians at some point will say, we are no longer bound by the limits of the treaty. There's some other bad news. In 1987, President Reagan and then President Gorbachev of Russia signed the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. This had to do with intermediate range missiles that were stationed either in Europe or in Asia. And they succeeded, it was a remarkable achievement, in eliminating this entire class of nuclear weapons, intermediate range nuclear weapons. But the United States under President Trump now has walked away from that. And it is not, the Russians have said so far, we will not redeploy INFs, intermediate nuclear forces, so long as the United States does not. But at the moment, there is no regulation of the intermediate nuclear forces. So for the first time, we are in uncharted waters. Since the SALT process began between the United States and the Soviet Union in the 1970s, we could, come February, be in a situation where there are no longer any arms control agreements regulating the qualitative or quantitative arms race between Russia and the United States. This at a time when anti-satellite weapons are coming online or being developed, or hypersonic weapons that are far more rapid than ballistic weapons are coming online. So in the short run, I am concerned that we are in a bad patch now.
Pessimism is warranted. Optimism is also warranted, and we'll have to see which wins out. I certainly agree with everything you've said.
So I want to actually take that as a segue to the question at the beginning of the chat here. We had Aaron, and I think others have asked about the upcoming election in the US and any sort of predictions from you all about how the election might affect the national or global security orientation of the US on some of these key areas of conflict. So we could think about it affecting North Korea, which just came up. And so I would be interested to hear your perspectives on this administration's approach to North Korea, where there's obviously a unconventional relationship that's been built between President Trump and Kim Jong-un. There is also the question of whether sanctions have been effective in this case in kind of pushing him towards some kind of negotiations, or is this all essentially PR and pomp and circumstance and there's not a lot going on behind it? How do we expect the election and the different potential outcomes of this election to shape the US's position towards actors like North Korea, Iran, and Russia?
Rajan, do you want to start or should I?
Marty, start. I'll follow you. I think we'll alternate.
Without getting into politics here and supporting one candidate or the other, I would say that the pandemic is affecting this election in very serious ways. And the pandemic is affecting our perception of national security. Max Boot, who is a conservative columnist, and if you go to my Rethinking National Security homepage, I have a link to his column, March 31st of this year. What he writes is, between the pandemic and the 9/11 attacks, the financial meltdown of 2008, there have been so many emergencies that fall outside our traditional national security parameters. It calls into question whether we're spending our $738 billion defense budget on the right priorities. He is saying we need to rethink national security. So I think this election is forcing us to do that, and the pandemic mixed in with it.
Great, Rajan.
I have no predictions about the election, hopes maybe, but no predictions. I'm not a specialist in American politics, and I don't know that any specialist in American politics knows what will happen. But I will say this, let's assume that President Trump loses and there is no fight about who really won or lost, and there is a President Biden. I don't envy him because he's going to inherit a colossal economic mess. In the first quarter of this year, on an annualized basis, the American economy contracted by about 29%. That is the single largest contraction since the Great Depression. In the second quarter, there was an uptick, an expansion, annualized at about 19.7%. But mind you, that uptick occurred in the wake of two things. The Fed throwing about $3 trillion of liquidity into the markets, and the CARES Act, which was about 2.3 million, which gave a trillion, excuse me, thank you, Marty, which gave people an extension on unemployment benefits, about $600 a week, and then a one-time payout for one person, $1,200, for a couple, $2,400. Now the CARES Act has run out. There has been no agreement on how it can be extended, and barring some additional liquidity poured into the economy, I don't see any way that it can revive. And so the question is, will we have a government in which the two parties can come to an agreement on an appropriate number to ramp up the economy? The argument that you can't go into deficit because you have one in the midst of a severe economic crisis is complete nonsense. Interest rates are so low that borrowing costs very little. You won't be crowding out private investment. And any economist, except perhaps a monetarist, would tell you that without an infusion of liquidity into the markets, hoping that the magic of the marketplace will solve this is, I think, hoping for the unicorn.
Yeah. One thing that I would add, separate from the economic problems that a potential Biden presidency would face, the Obama attacked Libya, as I pointed out, unwittingly encouraging nuclear proliferation by showing that if you had nuclear weapons, you won't be attacked. And if you give them up, you might be attacked, even in spite of promises. So the Democrats have a long ways to go too. And this is a nonpartisan problem. It's an old way of thinking.
I'm glad Marty raised that. So let me add the following. When I look at the Biden foreign policy team, some of whom I know quite well, I have to say that I have mixed feelings, because the neoconservatives who launched the Iraq War of 2003 and the liberal internationalists have the following in common. They have an ingrained belief that the United States should use its power to reorder the internal structure of countries. Now, we know enough from Afghanistan, from Iraq, and most recently from Libya, to know that that is not an easy thing to do. And when there's failure, the results are colossally dangerous for the country itself. People die in instability and conflict, but also for the region. Take Libya, for example. It is now the gravest national security threat to the entire North Africa. But there's another cost. There's a group at Brown University that tries to map out how much we have spent in anti-terrorism or terrorism-related wars since 9/11. And if you take the money that's been spent and the money that's been obligated for the out years, it's about $4.5 trillion. And so some of the people in the Biden administration are not neocons, but they are very much, I think, of the mind that projecting American power far and wide, remaking the internal order of countries, interventions like Libya, which if not thought out and done badly, can end up in terrible disaster. I think there are a fair number of such people there. So I have to say, I have mixed feelings about this team. On North Korea, which Marty was discussing, I don't see any fresh approach. I think the default tendency is to classify North Korea as a rogue state, to apply sanctions on it, not realizing that the more you use the term rogue state and regime change, the more incentive you give for countries like Iran and North Korea to have the ultimate insurance policy, which is nuclear weapons. It's a self-defeating approach.
Good points. And just to add a couple of things. In my report, paper on rethinking national security, one of the assumptions that I raise questions about is the oft-stated statement, not a fact, that the United States is the world's sole remaining superpower. We hear it so often, we can't help but believe it's true. And yet, what does it mean to be a superpower? If it means immense destructive power, isn't Russia a superpower? Isn't China a superpower? And is North Korea even a small superpower? Are we the world's sole remaining conventional superpower? And if so, what good does that do us in a nuclear age? we need to apply the zealous search for the truth with a ruthless disregard for commonly held beliefs when contradicted by observations. And just to show that we don't do that, and this was a Democrat, John F. Kennedy, and the first day, I think it was the first day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, he forgets that he's trying to figure out why the Russians would be so reckless as to put missiles 90 miles off our shore, forgetting that we had just put missiles in Turkey, very similar missiles, which are right on the border of the Soviet Union in those days. He says, it's almost as if we put a bunch of MRBMs in Turkey. Now that'd be goddamn dangerous, exact quote. McGeorge Bundy, his national security advisor, has to remind him, but sir, we did that. Then instead of saying, oh, now I understand, he zealously hides from the truth by saying, but that was different. He just said it would be the same. Now he says it's different. And all of his advisors join him in coming up with an illogical logic as to why it's different. So we need to really become much more rational, much more scientific in our approach to foreign policy. If we did that, I think we would be saved.
Diana, can I add a quick footnote? I mentioned that between us and the Russians now, arms control come February could be dead. That is, there could be no arms control regime restraining qualitative and quantitative improvements. But in the meantime, what is perhaps even more discouraging is that in Syria, in the Black Sea, in the Baltic Sea, in the Mediterranean, on numerous occasions, there have been close encounters between American forces and Russian forces. This can only go on so far to the point where something that nobody expected happens, a collision, that then leads to some kind of escalation that nobody can bring under control. And we are in an era now where we are saying there is a new Cold War between us and the Russians, which means that on other issues, be it climate change or arms control or what have you, the Russians are not brought into the picture. So the US-Russian relationship is now very, very dicey. I will say one final thing, and that is China. China is fast coming to replace the Soviet Union as the new threat on which both liberals and conservatives face. But in the case of China too, in the South China Sea, just in the last 2 months, there have been numerous encounters between Chinese forces and American forces. So quite apart from the nuclear arms control on the conventional level, we need to have much clearer agreements on separation of forces, what to do if accidents occur, communication systems that prevent accidental spirals from escalating to the point where nobody can control them anymore.
The best time to stop a crisis is before it occurs in the early stages of formation, and that's when most people aren't paying attention. That's the risk analysis approach that I've been championing, and that would hopefully be brought into this National Academy study that Congressman Cooper has written into law.
So I want to lump a few questions from the chat together. We had, speaking of China, a question from Satrio. With the emergence of China's influence in the international community with things like Belt Road Initiative, do you think hard power has become obsolete these days? And there was another question in the chat about increasing economic interdependence between countries and just general interdependence in numerous spheres, and whether that has made, again, things like nuclear threats or military confrontations less relevant. And so if you could speak a little bit to soft power, economic relationships between countries, and maybe if that does reflect on kind of the US-China relationship moving forward. Rajan, you're positioning it as sort of a new rising threat to at least liberal internationalists and certain elements of the right in the country, seeing China as this very prominent adversary. But are there ways in which that relationship can be seen as less adversarial? Yeah.
Absolutely. First of all, economic interdependence is no guarantee against major war, as 1914 shows. Germany and Britain were becoming economically intertwined, and yet a spark set it off, and the same could happen today. And on soft power, we need to think about soft power in terms, the fundamental thing that seems to cause wars is humiliation. World War II was really in many ways World War 1.1 and a function of the humiliation of Germany at the Treaty of Versailles. And the current aggressive stance of China has been traced by some academics, it's not my area of expertise, to President Clinton sending two aircraft battle groups into the area with China when the third Taiwan Straits crisis erupted in the mid-90s. And China was humiliated, and they said that we're never going to let that happen again. So this comes back to, is the US the world's sole remaining superpower? Even if we were, should we thump our chest and act like we're king of the mountain, or should we give other countries credit where credit's due? On the 70th anniversary of D-Day in, 2014, I tried to get a colleague of mine, now deceased, he'd been Dean of Engineering here at Stanford, he was a D-Day veteran, to write a letter to Obama, which we did. I helped him with it, and we got it on John Kerry's desk with the indications, thanking the Russians for their part in defeating Nazism. Bill Kays was my friend's name. He would have been facing 5 times as many defenders on Omaha Beach if it hadn't been for the Soviets on the Eastern Front. The problem was, in February 2014, Crimea and Ukraine happened, and President Obama could not say anything good about the Russians, no matter how true, no matter how accurate it was. And that's an indication of this, the problem we have. We need to get over that. Rajan, anything?
So on the chat question on hard power, economic power, and soft power, they all will continue to exist. It depends on what you're trying to achieve. So if you're trying to win a war or deter somebody from attacking you, you need hard power. If you're engaged in trade negotiations, you need economic power. If you're in the business of trying to win hearts and minds by putting forward a favorable view of your country, you need soft power. So hard power is not going to go away, neither is economic power and soft power. I reject the proposition, as much as I'd like to believe it, that hard power has become obsolete, because as Marty pointed out, the biggest mistake that people make in studying war is to treat countries as if they behave like chartered accountants. They don't just do bottom line calculations. Time and time again, they've done extraordinarily stupid things that made no sense whatsoever in economic terms, but were taken for other reasons, insecurity being one of them. So I think you'll have all three operating at the same time. On China, there are 2 observations I'd like to make. From the Chinese perspective, the last 200 years of history were an aberration. They were reduced to a peripheral country that was acted upon by more powerful countries, more primarily Western countries. But for the 500 years before that, China was the Middle Kingdom. It was the center of economic and technological and cultural power, not the only one, but a major center of power. So as they see it, what has happened now is they've come back to what is normalcy. Now, the way the United States sees it, especially after the Cold War, when unipolarity was celebrated, the Soviet Union is gone, the United States now reigns supreme, it sees the possibility that unipolarity will be undercut. And it'll be undercut by a country which ideologically and in terms of its political organization is very different from the United States. That's what makes this power transition different. When there was a power transition between the United States and Britain, it worked out relatively smoothly. Not so smoothly between Germany and Britain, as witnessed World War I. Now, the point is not to say that we're headed for a conflict with China. It is that barring some catastrophic instability in China, we are going to have to find out how to live with a China that is much more powerful than it is even now, and whether to accommodate it reasonably or to treat it as an adversary. And if you do the latter, you're going to be involved in a much more ruinous arms competition than you were even with the Soviet Union, because the Chinese simply have much more economic capacity than the Soviet Union ever did.
We need to actually look at power. And in the book my wife and I wrote, which a free PDF is available, and I think the link will be made available, about 35 years ago, we'd had a huge fight. We haven't had a fight in almost 20 years, by the way. But 35 years ago, we were still fighting. And I retreated to the living room, and I was licking my wounds and thinking, how am I gonna, when's this crazy woman gonna come to her senses? It's all her fault. And she was, of course, feeling the same way in the bedroom. And then I thought to myself, which would I rather was true? That my current perspective was right and was all her fault, in which case I was powerless to do anything to get out of the pain I was in? Or would I rather that maybe there was a piece of I had some part in starting this argument that I was missing, in which case I could apologize for that, no ifs, ands, and buts, and potentially start a reconciliation process. With that motivation, I was able to find where I had contributed to starting the fight. I went into Dorothy, my wife's name, and I apologized to her, no ifs, ands, and buts. She then apologized to me. The whole thing was settled. It helped me realize, and the same is true internationally, that there's tremendous power in admitting our mistakes. We see it as a weakness, and politically it's phrased that way. But I am convinced if we look at the situation with that zealous search for the truth, we will find that admitting our mistakes, apologizing for our mistakes, not beating ourselves up over it because everyone's done it, will have give us tremendous power.
Just a supplementary footnote, if I may. When countries face a crisis, that is, they expect that tensions are rising and war is a possibility, not an inevitability, they fall victim very often to what social psychologists call the fundamental attribution error, which goes as follows. I look at you, my adversary, and say, you have lots of choices and lots of leeway, but you're acting in this way deliberately with malice. Whereas when I look at myself, I say, well, I'm constrained by circumstances. I have no choice but to act that way. But if both sides are thinking the same way, the crisis simply ratchets up. It's not dissimilar from the example that Marty gave about the momentary quarrel between his wife and him.
Right. But Lee Ross, who's a friend and colleague here in psychology, I think came up with that term, fundamental attribution error. And whenever we portray them as evil, that's but it's understandable that we're behaving the same way. We have these circumstances that force us to be that way. That's a sure sign that you're suffering from the fundamental attribution error.
Yeah, just a challenge to the audience, by the way. Next time you have a disagreement with a friend or a relative, just watch your thinking and you will almost certainly be trapped in the fundamental attribution error. It happens to me all the time, I confess.
I think we've all been there, whether in personal relationships or otherwise.
This is why international relationships work the way they do. It's all just society built up.
Yeah, I mean, I think I think this ties into some of what we were discussing earlier with sort of climate change and nuclear proliferation, and how to address the fact that how we got where we are on these issues was largely due to the actions, and some would say irresponsibility, of the major Western powers and the major nuclear armed states, Security Council powers. And how do we sort of address past, the costs that were imposed on the global community because of the past actions of powerful countries, while also looking ahead and trying to reduce these future threats that are going to affect all of us, climate change, nuclear proliferation, et cetera. And so I think that that's something that I've been thinking about in reading your paper, Marty, and also over the course of this discussion. So that might just be food for thought. There's also a question or a couple questions in the chat about the Middle East and the US's role in that region. And I think, coming off of our discussion of the election and US foreign policy more broadly, even if we were to expect a more isolationist approach in the wake of the pandemic and in the wake of the very destructive conflicts in the Middle East that the US has been involved in that you mentioned, even if we sort of expect that kind of isolationist approach in the future, are there any costs to that in thinking about trying to promote international cooperation on these issues that are important to you, Marty, and to you, Rajan? So on issues like arms control and climate change, et cetera. Is there a way to be isolationist in certain ways, right? Militarily isolationist, or perhaps less involved in promoting regime transitions in other countries, but also be an active player at the table on these other important issues?
one of the assumptions that needs to be looked at is that it's either this or it's that. Either we are isolationist or interventionist. There are lots of things in between. The same as people think either we need to get rid of all nuclear weapons or we need to do business as usual. With 14,000 nuclear weapons in the world, even just numerically, there are at least 14,000 intermediate points. And there are a lot of other things we can do that have nothing to do with nuclear weapons that would reduce nuclear risk, like not attacking Libya next time the option comes up.
I don't know a single country for whom isolationism is an option. I would even argue that in its history, although there was a period of American history that's referred to as a period of isolationism, it's really a misnomer, because isolationism, defined as not having anything to do with the rest of the world, is simply impossible. And there was never any period of American history when we did that, because even in the so-called isolationist period, we were very active in 1,000 different ways, militarily and economically, in this hemisphere. So I don't think that is an option.
And the Philippines.
Sorry?
And the Philippines.
And the Philippines, yes, 1898. The real question is, how are you engaged and what it is you're trying to do? So are you engaged in addressing the pandemic? Are you engaged in nuclear proliferation? Are you engaged in arms control? Or are you engaged in the kinds of activities, the return on investment of which is very low in strategic terms or economic terms? And I have as Exhibit A, the forever wars. Note that in Iraq and Afghanistan, we have been there now for over 20 years. And there is no prospect whatsoever of a military victory in Afghanistan. It is not even clear that you can withdraw without the Taliban ultimately coming to power. But we have spent huge amounts of money, thousands of American lives, tens of thousands of Afghan lives. And this is what we have to show after 20 years. And one of the reasons that Trump was successful, I think, is that he at some level understood that there was a weariness about the forever wars because it was a very large part of his campaign. Now, I don't think he had the right solution to it necessarily, but I think he understood there was a certain war weariness in this country, along with an increasing distrust of the political order. But I think that that kind of engagement, that kind of repudiation of isolationism would be very bad. But there are many ways in which one can be engaged in positive ways. And I think for a country like the United States, it's almost imperative. Ditto China, ditto Western Europe.
Great. So I am going to probably wrap us up soon because I think we're done at 1:45, but maybe each of the panelists can conclude with any, 1-minute remarks, issues you wanted to touch on that we didn't get a chance to discuss, or any kind of parting messages for the audience.
Okay, I'll take 1 minute. And it comes back to penniless immigrants coming to this country. It's a question of isolationism. Make America great again. America first. America, what is America? All of us came from other places. Even the Native Americans, the American Indians originally came from somewhere else. And it's really weird to me that once somebody is here with a green card, he or she is given all of the normal benefits that an American is entitled to. In fact, it's against the law to discriminate against them. And yet, when over there, we could care less. It's in our national interest, in our self-interest, to make those other places better so that we don't have the huge immigration issues that some people warn about. And that's what I'd like to see America do. And you asked about cost before, so just one thing I'll add there. The ultimate cost would be the end of civilization in a nuclear war. And if we don't adopt a more inclusive view of the world, that's where we'll end up.
So I have no profound parting thoughts, but I would like to thank Marty for coming, and thank you, Diana, for moderating this. Thank you, Dean Rich, and for the 50 plus people who've stayed around. Thank you so much. I mean, there has been a discussion in the faculty about whether during the pandemic, the intellectual excitement at City College has withered on the vine. And I've been in so many of these events, and the answer is a resounding no, as witness your participation. A special thanks to my students who after having endured 75 minutes of me earlier today, have nevertheless shown up for 1.5 hours more. So thank you all for attending.
Yes, and I encourage Marty and Rajan, please do look at the chat. I wasn't able to get to all the questions, some other fantastic questions and comments in there.
If you can save the questions, that would help, because when this session ends, the chat goes away.
We will save it, and I'd be happy to share it with you. I just want to add my thanks very quickly. Marty, thank you very much. It really was your initiative that made this event happen. Professor Menon, thank you for your wisdom. And Diana, thank you for so ably moderating. It gave us a lot to think about. I was struck. I want to say that I have always thought that decision-making could be done better if a psychologist was in the room. And Victoria Borisova, you've shared that in the chat. So thank you for that. A lot to think about from here on out. I just want to invite everybody to future events that we're going to be holding over the next 3 weeks, which will all focus on the election. And we have one this Thursday and then 2 in the weeks that follow that will examine what we should expect of the elections and then what we will have learned from the elections. But we had a nice preview of that today in this conversation. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And again, Marty, Rajan, Diana, thank you very much for a wonderful discussion today.
Thanks, Andy. Goodbye, everybody.
Thank you for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Bye-bye.